Good morning. Thanks for joining us. We're probably going to have a few more people trickle in as we move forward. But Tyra, thank you for being here. Sorry for making you wait in the waiting room, but we appreciate that you joined us. I just sent out an email just reminding people that we are meeting today. I did get a few responses from some people who I think are out of town this week. And actually tomorrow is Native American Day in California. And so a lot of tribes are closed tomorrow for the holiday, but we have folks from outside of California and I'm at work. Tomorrow's the holiday, not today, but that may be a reason why we're missing a few people. But as always, we're gonna push forward, and we have our recording so people can always go back and revisit what we talk about today. So Angie, did you want to do any sort of introductions for today?
Well, yeah. Hi, Tyra. I'm glad to have you here. So this is our second to last webinar, actually, and it's good. We're going to record everything we do. We distribute it to the whole registration list of, what do we have, 60 people registered, and they always can review it in their own time. This topic actually came out of the conversations we had at the very beginning of this series, where we were sort of trying to co-create what we were going to do together, make sure the topics were relevant, and folks really shared that accessing and protecting cultural data and TEK related to climate change was something that they did want to have a whole discussion about. And so, the way it fits into our whole training series so far is that we've been through a lot over the last year, including all the planning processes and really diving into the vulnerability assessment, some of the considerations for that, and the adaptation planning process, and then really diving into strategies, which we have done over the last 3 webinars. So we've gone through 3 strategy dives, and this one we're kind of coming back out the other end and maybe starting to think about these bigger picture issues, and some of these that last long beyond an adaptation plan. So they continue to be relevant even after you've adopted your adaptation plan and you're implementing, you're monitoring, and you're just responding to climate change events and disasters. So that's what we're going to do a little bit today. We're going to talk about this kind of bigger picture issue on accessing and protecting cultural data and TK for climate trend analysis and real-time action. And I have to start this conversation by really admitting that this is not an area of expertise for me. And I think all of you carry a lot more expertise on this. So I'll really be I'm structuring a conversation to facilitate good dialogue and share some examples, and we'll have lots of chance for that. And I did try to get some speakers here, and I wasn't able to, but I do hope that any of you that are on today, as you're listening, maybe you will, when there's a point in time a little bit later on, volunteer to say a few words about the experiences you're having at your tribe. You can sort of just present on the fly. You don't have to do anything to prep, but just share a little bit about how these topics are hitting your tribe. So then we'll do our little discussion where we bring out our mural, and we will develop our wisdom well like we always do. And that's what's on board for today. As always, we like to start off by reviewing our reading that we had suggested at our last webinar. This one was a kind of a technical reading. It's I don't suspect anybody's read every single word, but it is an interesting resource. I actually would be really interested to hear if you think it's a good resource. This one is from the Tribal Legal Development Clinic at UCLA School of Law, and it's called The Need for Confidentiality Within Tribal Cultural Resource Protection. Found it thorough, and I'm interested in if you feel like it's accurate, that it's culturally informed enough. And I did throw a few questions out there. So maybe, I don't know if Tina or Shasta, if you could drop the link, or I can do that. I can drop the link to this document into the chat, or I'll do it when I get a sec in just a minute. You did get it in your emails, everyone. But the first question I had posed, it relates to what I've actually pasted here on the slide. So in your tribe's experience, to what extent are Article 11, 12, and 31 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People relating to protecting tribal knowledge being practiced? So this is just about your experiences with these statutes. They're not necessarily binding on the United States, but this was the intent coming out of the UN. And how has the meaningful safeguarding of tribal information been breached for you? So that's a big question. And we may take a minute just to kind of look at these articles. I doubt any of you have these on the tip of your brain, but might be useful to look at because you've got these to lean on, I suppose, if you need to. Shasta, has this come up for you? Do you look at this? Is this posted on your bedroom mirror?
Well, it's definitely not posted on my bedroom mirror, but it's something that comes up on a fairly regular basis, is reference to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And unfortunately, because it is simply a UN declaration, it doesn't have any binding authority anywhere. It's just what the UN has recommended as the way that Indigenous peoples and their issues should be dealt with on a global level. So it's not just about North America. I was fortunate in the courses that I took for the OU's, University of Oklahoma's Indigenous Peoples Law Program, to spend some time with these documents and with UN DRIP and other types of declarations on Indigenous rights. And what I find comes up more often than not is people saying, hey, what about UN DRIP? Is this something that you are following? And the answer is usually no. Sometimes there's an acknowledgement that, yeah, we know this is a thing that exists, but when you're dealing with on the ground sort of stuff, when it comes to the staff level interactions that you have with agencies or with organizations that might be doing work in climate change, this isn't something that's at the forefront of their minds. They're thinking about things from the purely environmental perspective of, how are we going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How are we going to manage sea level rise? How are we going to deal with heat and other health issues related to climate change? They're not thinking also, how is this potentially going to impact tribal knowledge and the protection and sensitivity of that knowledge? So, and maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but my recommendation for people when they are developing their adaptation plans is to have a section that talks about this, the protection of tribal ecological knowledge, and what your specific tribal nation or even the organization that you work for is committed to the protection of this data. Whether, again, that's protecting it on the tribal side, where you say this is what we are and are not willing to share, and these are the parameters we're putting in place if we are going to share it with people who are, ostensibly trying to help us with our efforts. And then on the agency side, what is your practice in terms of managing your relationships with tribes and helping them to ensure that what they are telling you is going to be kept confidential and yet respected at the same time? So it's a really tough needle to thread to say, we want to have protection and we want to have the sharing of this knowledge to the degree that tribes are willing to share it. But we also need to make sure that we are not giving out information that's not ours to give. So just to put a little bit of an example on that, and it's one that I have used over and over again in different arenas, is to think about the environmental impacts of things like lithium mining. That for the most part, from an environmental standpoint, lithium is necessary for batteries. Batteries are used in EVs. Driving an EV reduces your greenhouse gas emissions. So it's all good, right? But if you're from a tribe where the lithium mine that's been proposed is going to completely destroy a site that's sacred to your people, how do you manage that kind of a thing? And how do you put that into your own climate adaptation plan and say, yes, we're going to encourage electric vehicle use, we're going to put that infrastructure at our tribe, but we don't want lithium mining that's going to destroy our sacred area. So it really is a difficult tension between what we're trying to do in terms of climate protection and adaptation and mitigation, and then what we're trying to do in terms of cultural resource protection, and they don't always mesh. And I'd love to hear from other folks on the call who work for tribes or tribal citizens about what you think about the UN Declaration. And even if you've heard of it, and if not, if you want to know more about it, open the floor. And I may call on you just because there's only a few people here today.
This one around states got me thinking that maybe we just read this one out loud and see how we think it's going in your state. And we do have maybe even Osama, not to put you on the spot, but just, if I'd be interested to hear whether or not this has come to you. Is this something that you've been asked to, use in your practice? So this Article 11, number 2 says states, and they probably don't mean like United States, but I'm going to say it anyways. States shall provide redress through effective mechanisms, which may include restitution, development in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, and respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. To provide redress. I'm not even sure what that would look like.
Do you hear that, Osama? You're on the spot.
Yeah, it's not something that's come up for me specifically, but I think that it is a really interesting topic. So for background, I actually am a trained mediator, and one thing that I think about when you're coming up with kind of a conflict resolution process is like, what is the path forward? And really what you're trying to do when working with both sides is help them not fixate too much on what happened, but really try to like look for solutions. And so but I think part of that process is often, the party that's been hurt or harmed or had something stolen from them. I think in this case, or maybe accidentally breached, needs to feel like they've been heard in the process. So I think if we were coming up with some kind of restitution process, if for when tribal information is breached, which can happen, I think, unintentionally sometimes, I think it has to involve giving the tribe an opportunity to really voice all of the impact that breach might have on them, and then also figuring out then what do you do about it, and how do we try to rectify the situation. I would love to hear if people have experienced this actually, and with your tribe, and kind of mismanagement of your tribal knowledge or information by non-tribal parties.
Well, so Tim had a comment in the chat where he said it never gets referenced, the UN DRIP, when discussing TEK practices or guidance with state and local agencies, especially in the field of co-management. So I want to clarify something here, and Angie, you already alluded to this, that when the UN refers to a state, they're talking about countries. They're obviously it's the United Nations. So states is one of those terms that is in reference to self-governing self-governing places. So I think we can have that subset of the states within the United States be a part of that, but those states aren't UN members. The United States is the UN member, but that doesn't mean that this isn't a good piece of or a good reference for what is the right thing to do. The declaration, I will say, the declaration is very much it's a document that is aspirational. It's not one that is enforceable. So this is more like, this is what we want to see happen. But in looking at these 3 questions that you posed here, Angie, I can certainly say with number 2 that tribal knowledge is mistrusted, misinterpreted, or omitted all the time. And Tim, if you want to unmute and talk about that a little bit, since you put the comments in there, I'd love to hear what some of Grayton's experiences with that have been, if you have any that you can share. Oh, Tim's like, why'd you do this to me, Shasta?
I'm sorry. I'm
That's
sorry.
okay.
I had to step away. I'm sorry. It's such a heavy subject. No, just kidding. Um,
Did you hear the question?
I'm sorry. Could you please restate the question?
Of
Thank you.
course, of course. See, that's what happens. You know that when you step away, I'm gonna know. No, I since you put in the quote or in the comments rather, the chat, what you had experienced, that this isn't referenced. I'm wondering if you have any specific experiences at Grayton with number 2 in particular, that tribal information is not trusted, or it's breached, or it's misused.
From my recent experience, and this is maybe more of just an observation, it's funny when tribes get brought into the discussion about co-management or protecting resources or how to involve a tribe in another system, be that local, state, federal, is that when you're talking with the agencies, specifically regarding locations, I'm giving an experience here of a park, that this whole idea from the land manager of it's their resource, meaning the park. These are our resources. These are our master plans. This is all what we want to do. But we want the tribe to help us out, carry out the plan. When that's what I was referencing in the comment, that anytime that state, or even when they talk about a tribe being part of a plan or part of a process, they never reference this UN declaration, which is just amazing in this day and age. If so-called support organizations or these relationships are getting better, that there's not even an acknowledgement in the general sphere of things when talking about these issues. So it's a great topic, and that's why I'm looking forward to today's presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I always appreciate your insights. And maybe is Liz still on? Oh no, it looks like she disappeared. I was going to make her talk about some of her experiences with her tribe. And Heidi, what about you down there at La Posta? Are there issues that you deal with that where you feel like the tribe's knowledge is not being appropriately included when it comes to climate work?
Not really. We're pretty small, so we don't really have like anybody going out and I guess advocating for like shared knowledge, and our knowledge is so limited because we have like one elder and they don't really know or have as much to pass on. So our tribe is fairly young and a lot of our elders are gone, so we don't have that, I guess, to share and pass on yet. So we're getting there. We're getting, we might have it in the future, but for now, not really.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you
have
for
an
sharing that
interesting story. I remember your story because I worked with you guys a bit, and it is an interesting story where there's this little bit of a gap in your rights.
Osamu.
Yeah, I'm interested in this excerpt here about, valuing oral testimony and oral histories, because I know, for tribes that do have more elders kind of passing down traditional knowledge, that when you interact with Western and settler colonial institutions, that they put so much value on the written word, and kind of if it doesn't, if it's not formatted in a way in terms of kind of like being a written comment on a document or something, then it's not taken as science or fact. And I think I'm really interested to see with the California Office of Planning and Research's work on this new climate assessment and other ongoing efforts to really kind of uplift tribal voices as a part of the state's climate related planning, how we can make sure that like we're doing a really good job of listening to people's oral histories and recording them, and when that's what they want, and making sure that as delivered, it becomes a part of, is weighed on the same level as our different like scientific measures or other ways that we, talk about climate change, for example.
I always think about Lori Montserrat, our friend at OEHA, who sadly couldn't be here today, but pretty much could teach a master class on how to do that well, because she did it really well here in California when she did record a lot of the perspectives on climate change from a lot of tribes throughout the state I think in a really, I think a culturally sensitive way, a way that did not breach any or violate any of these laws. And I guess, by the way, I'll mention this report, if you read the whole thing, it starts by talking about the UN, but it does reference also that the United States has its own legislation that refers to these kinds of things. So it's possible that when you guys are out there doing this stuff, if you see anything referenced, it's probably more applicable to just the United States legislation.
Yeah, and when it comes to the stuff that the United States has done, it really also is along the same lines of being, say, an executive order or some sort of a resolution, but it's not usually stuff that really has the binding force of law. And so when you see here in this pull quote that the National Park Service is saying they can't accept a tribe's unexplained, unelaborated, and unjustified request for repatriation, that has to do probably with a NAGPRA claim, National Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act claim, which is not directly related to climate, but it gets to this larger issue that we have that, let's say, when a tribe is looking for funding to help protect something that's being impacted by climate change, but it has a cultural or traditional basis more so than a quote unquote scientific basis, then there might be some person reviewing that who says, well, we're not going to give you money for that because it's just at your say so. But it's reminding me of an event that I attended yesterday, and one of the speakers is Dr. Stan Rodriguez, who's from the Ipai Nation of Santa Isabel, and he runs Kumeyaay Community College. He talked about how tribal information can show us what has changed. And his example was that there are cultural sites that are now underwater. So the climate's been changing for generations, for tens of thousands of years, because those sites used to be coastal and now they're underwater. And that there are fish traps, archaeological remnants of fish traps in the desert. So we know that there was water there and fishing was being done in these areas that are now dry and desolate. And why would we not want to use that kind of knowledge in the adaptation plans, not only for individual tribal nations and other communities, but also as part of our planning for the United States or the entire world? And Heidi, you said, and it's true in the chat, that Stan is a well of knowledge, and he's also really funny. So it's always fun to see him on a panel. So yeah, I could talk about this for the next hour and 36 minutes that we have remaining in our time. So Angie, I don't know if you wanted to move on to the next thing, or if other people had comments they wanted to make. And also welcome to Yvonne, who just joined us. And actually, Yvonne, I think you and Tyra are recent registrants to our webinar series. So if you like, I'd want to give you an opportunity to unmute or even come on camera and introduce yourselves if you so choose.
Yes, this is Yvonne Fish. I work for the Building Affairs and Northwest Regional Office and Natural Resources. We have 45 tribes that we serve in one tribe in Alaska, Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And we have many tribes that are trying to be on board with the climate and cultural resource acknowledgement. Anything that I can glean and pass on to the tribes would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you so much for being here. And Tyra, how about you?
Yes, hello, and thank you for the welcome. So I'm down in Houston, Texas right now, actually about to make a move to back to Austin, Texas. I've been working with the city of Houston. I'm a technology attorney, and I work with climate mitigating technologies, what some call clean tech, renewable energy, solar, and wind. And I've also done quite a bit of work. I've been working with federal grants for the city of Houston, including the COVID grant, the ARPA, I think that was the American Recovery Plan Act. And tribal communities were mentioned quite a lot in that Treasury bill that was released, the final ruling for ARPA. And so I'm kind of interested in how to utilize funding, perhaps federal funding, in support of climate projects that would benefit tribes.
Well, I'm so glad that you're here, both of you. Really appreciate it. We have one more webinar that's next week that's going to finish up our round of 12, but everything is online, so you always have the opportunity to go back and learn from what we have put together. And that's our point here, is we're trying to get that expert knowledge or knowledge from people who are in the field and make it available to people offline as well as they do their work. So, and of course, we're going to be continuing with more opportunities for training and participation as we move forward into the next round of funding. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. All right, Angie, back to you.
Right. Well, this last question is something I think is going to flow through the rest of the webinar today, which is really about this. The report talks so much about the need for confidentiality. And so we get to think into what does that mean for ensuring TEK helps both to accurately inform broader climate policy and planning while also not disclosing what we can't. So that's kind of a big topic of today, and not the only one. So in beginning this conversation, like we always do, we like to wet the whistle a little bit on the topic with just some information that we were able to compile. I tried to get our friend James Rattling Leaf to come speak, but he wasn't able to. Sadly, he has a lot of different roles that he plays that are really significant at the national level when it comes to traditional ecological knowledge, and he has helped us in the past and participated in some of our things. But instead, I was able to go to one of the websites he supports. It's the Ecological Society of America. And I just was able to find a really good clip that I wanted to share from this person who is an expert, Dr. Vivian Delgado. And she gave a presentation on non-Western epistemology of knowledge. And I just wanted to share a few minutes of that clip. Just have to give me 1 second to go back to grabbing my link that I need. So just 1 second. And I'm getting myself ready to play the short clip. That queued up. All right. It began at 15:50. So we'll just listen for a couple minutes here because I think it's useful to hear from an Indigenous person and scholar about what we're really talking about here: cultural data, Indigenous science, and traditional ecological knowledge. World. So I am actually. Is this sound coming through okay?
The sound's a little garbled, unfortunately. At least we have the closed captioning.
That's true. Okay. So she said, so I'm actually saying that yes, the earth and everything that is alive has consciousness. For most Indigenous people, it is an intellectual awareness that occurs organically and is directed by our 6 senses. I know that science does not use some of this information, especially in relationship to senses when you are testing, but it's a different kind of use of our 6 senses. Each of our senses, sight, touch, smell, hear, in mind has a consciousness. In addition, some levels of mind consciousness among the 2 legs are more developed than others. so that we do have people with special gifts who have a greater or more developed consciousness all the way around, usually people that also have a very high moral compass. Anyway, so talking about, I think, knowledge holders and how there's a different way of knowing that maybe Western science doesn't particularly know how to use or interpret. And so I'll just go back to the slide here for a moment, where I also have this quote, which is on the BIA's website, actually related to TEK and fuels management. But this is one definition that they use: traditional ecological knowledge as a cumulative body of knowledge and beliefs handed down through the generations by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and their environment. So I'll just stop and does that sound about right to you all? You all get to talk about this quite a bit. Does that seem like these are interesting representations, somewhat accurate representations of what we're talking about here?
We're getting a thumbs up from Yvonne. That's great.
So, I think we're talking about a couple of things here. So TEK, and also, what do I mean by cultural data? I guess it could be the same thing, but in my work trying to do adaptation work with tribes, we're also just coming across, cultural resource information. So where are your resources? What are your cultural resources? Where are your sites, your landmarks? So that kind of data information that is extremely sensitive to protect cultural resources. I'm wanting to engage in that conversation as well.
So I'm putting the link, the terrible long link to this video in the chat. It is worth watching the whole thing. And I've been fortunate to also be able to give presentations to the Ecological Society of America on similar topics. I'll say this about definitions of TEK. You're going to get a different definition for every person that you ask. I don't feel qualified to give a very in-depth definition of TEK beyond something like what you would find here on the BIA website or in other formalized places. But when you're talking to Indigenous folks, tribal citizens, practitioners, you're going to get different definitions of this. I'm thinking now of the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report. I was fortunate to be able to co-author a chapter in that on the protection of cultural resources from the changing climate. And one of the things we talked about was, how do we define, what is knowledge, what is ecological, what is traditional? And what we discovered also is that there's a lot of different ways of even naming what we're talking about. Where some people will say, well, we don't want to call it traditional because Western scientists are going to say, okay, well, if it's traditional, then it's not really science. It's just this kind of nebulous in your mind cultural thing. Culture and science are separate. They're different, right? Well, they're not. But try telling that to some of the most hard-nosed scientists. They just don't see it that way. And is it just ecological knowledge? We are all beings of the world. We all exist as part of the ecology of the earth. So is it really ecological, or is it just knowledge? And then let's add another piece to that, because why not? Knowledge in the singular. Can we talk about there just being a singular knowledge? There are multiple knowledges. Every culture, just like there are multiple cultures, has their own knowledge, or even different knowledges within an individual culture. So good on the BIA for having this definition. It's a reasonable definition, but my goodness, you could write an entire book on what actually is TEK or TK, or I've heard some people, and I like this one, tribal scientific knowledge. There's so many different ways to talk about it. And I will jump off my soapbox here because I'm curious if anybody else has any thoughts about that. And I'm not seeing any unmutes, so I will let you off the hook for now, and we'll go back to Angie.
Well, so what I wanted to do, like I said, I don't feel like a particular expert on this, though I encounter the interaction with TEK and cultural data a whole lot and have to try to figure out how to navigate it. So what I wanted to do is just structure this conversation so we can all dialogue. I did it by use case. What do I mean by use case? Use case meaning this kind of information has all sorts of ways it can be used. And I feel like oftentimes when we're in a conversation, usually with non-tribal entities, that it's really confusing. Like everybody's really confused about what information we're talking about and how it's going to be used. And it's occurred to me that we could kind of put it in buckets because there's all sorts of different ways that it can be used, and they all come with their different challenges and needs. So, we're talking specifically about TEK cultural data in the context of climate change for tribes. So the first use case is, you all are out there doing your own internal tribal planning, right? So your tribe developing your own climate adaptation plan. Like that's what we've been talking about. The majority of this series is sort of from that lens. And so the question for you all is what do you need in that process from your TEK and other cultural data? So, what I have observed is that TEK can really help a tribe more accurately understand historical climate conditions, as well as climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. So you can get a lot of information from Western science about what's happening, but the context and the longer history typically comes from your own TEK and records and oral histories. And you can also learn a lot about what effective strategies have been used in the past to adapt or from thousands of years of living in that particular landscape. And then in this process, tribes also want to be able to evaluate risk to cultural resources and develop strategies to protect them. And those are maybe two different things. One is using the TEK to generally braid it together with Western science and understand your general vulnerabilities. And the other one is to really look specifically at your own assets and be clear about what assets you're trying to protect, what they are, where they are. And that's been a big hurdle in my experience doing tribal adaptation plans, because that information is really sensitive and needs to be kept confidential. And so wanting to talk, does that sound, I'd like to hear more about what needs you have as you're doing your tribal planning. What do you need out of cultural data and TEK? How does that help you? Tessa, does these needs kind of seem to characterize things about right?
I think so. I think it's a good place to start from. And so each tribe, as I continue to reiterate, is going to have its own issues in terms of what it wants to cover and where it thinks its TEK can be helpful. There's also the other side of things where, like Heidi was mentioning, they may be in a process of restoring knowledge. And so it may not be something that is necessarily easy to come by, and it's going to take a little bit more effort. So, again, like mentioning, Dr. Rodriguez or somebody like Mike Connolly, who's with Campo and has done work on how different like fish weirs or different rock structures that can be made to hold water to help irrigate crops in a low water environment. That's the kind of thing that's being rediscovered and reintroduced to the tribes. On the other hand, and I might call on one of our newcomers here in Yvonne, working up in the Pacific Northwest. I was just up in the Pacific Northwest at Tribal Climate Camp in Washington State and got to hear from the Sklallam and the Quileute and the Salish Kootenai folks from all over, some folks from Alaska. And for them, TEK, there may be a much stronger knowledge base in terms of traditional shellfish harvesting or different uses for plants, for cedar. So, Yvonne, if you don't mind, do you have any examples of the use of traditional ecological knowledge for the tribes you work with in Region 10?
Well, I know a lot of the tribes, like we were saying, are kind of unsure as to, how much knowledge that they want to share, how it's going to be used, what information is out there already, because it can be construed, to impact them negatively. So a lot of them are reluctant to share some of that knowledge. And, I know a lot of the tribes, like you said, are, just now coming into getting information in their recent or their history, that they're, bringing back their languages, and, just imparting that to their own tribal members. So that's what I have to say.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, that gets to that key challenge there is gathering and safely storing knowledge, and then how do you decide what to share, what can be made public? Here in California, we see a lot of work being done on the reintroduction of cultural burning to the landscape to stimulate the growth of preferred plant species, to make things safer so that we don't have these tremendous wildfires that are burning decades worth of fuel load, that kind of thing. That's something that tribes have decided we do want to make this public, because we see that this has an impact beyond our own boundaries, beyond the knowledge holders of our own communities. We want to be able to protect our own communities and the what surrounds us, because a fire that starts outside of tribal lands is going to potentially come on to tribal lands. So that is public, and a lot of people are really fastening on to that and seeing it as a potential strategy in California and other parts of the West to manage wildfire. But there are challenges to that as well, not least of which is now the tribes feel the burden of being the knowledge holders that are supposed to be reteaching those, like say at the state level or at the federal level, that have had mismanagement of landscapes for fire. And now they're turning to the tribes and saying, whoops, you guys were doing it the right way all along. Can you give us back that information and teach us how to do it right? And so there is a little bit of a sense of, oh, you messed up and now you want us to fix it for you. And so that's another challenge. And then I'm seeing there's a question in the chat from Tim at Grayton. Anyone done any grant funding research to support cultural burning? Tim, are you talking about grant money to fund the research into its effectiveness or something else?
Well, I'm thinking of it from 2 points of view, and this is just for everyone's consideration too, from a grant perspective. Getting back to that co-management process I brought up earlier, we just did a cultural burn at Tole Regional Park here in Sonoma County. First time a burn like that's been done in over 200 years of that landscape.
Oh.
But I'm just thinking about going forward, how can we best support that practice? 1, 2, how can I get something funded to say how effective or ineffective was the burn? Because now they're talking about, hey, this went so great, let's talk about next year. And it's like, well, hold on a sec. What are some of those, some of those tangible environmental and both scientific benefits to prove to other agencies like CAL FIRE and some of those other folks out there that aren't really jumping in full-heartedly with this, because it took a lot for us to get the burn plan approved. And then again, like you said, having to share that information, but just trying to see what a climate funded project might look like research-wise, because there is that big CAL Adaptation grant out there for tribal research, or is it?
Yeah, I was just thinking about.
So that's what I'm thinking as an idea, but just maybe love to hear best practices or ideas from other folks that maybe have already gone down that road, so we don't repeat any mistakes. But thank you.
Yeah, that's terrific. Angie and I were both having the same thought, and then you brought up the grant, the Tribal Climate Research Grant, which I think that's a great idea. It's also, I would think, something that the tribes are going to have to partner with the research scientists. I know that even on my staff, which is pretty extensive, we don't really have the capacity or the expertise to do the actual study. And not to get too far down this road in terms of tangent, but the environment is much different now than it was when cultural burning was a regular traditional practice. You know, we had 1 million people, maybe Indigenous people in California before colonization, and now we have 3 million people just in San Diego County. So what does that mean in terms of how we can actually return this practice when we're dealing with a very, very different population and settlement patterns, or I should say, you know, building patterns, development patterns, and things like that. And then, you know, Tim, as you mentioned, getting a burn plan authorized. We tried to get one done here in Paula for earlier this year, and it was a cluster word I can't say on television. So yeah, and we didn't get it in time. So we still have a lot of those institutional barriers and things that we have to overcome to be able to, even with the stuff that we're willing to share, to have it be accepted and implemented. So I am with you 100% on the need for research, not only on the effectiveness in the under modern conditions, but also on the barriers to being able to implement it, both on tribal lands and with partners.
Yeah, I was thinking about the role of research in helping a tribe do this gathering and storing, right? So and you're talking about real time, kind of like current information. And I'm wondering if some of this research money out there could help them help a tribe go back to collecting from their elders or others, or, you know, records that aren't well organized, to compile that.
Yeah.
In my experience working with various tribes, I see that they're just kind of all over the board in terms of the sort of status of their records. And it's not like better or worse, it's just how much have they decided to document, I guess, in a way that can be used today, maybe more easily. And in some cases, I see that the climate adaptation planning process comes around, and it is that opportunity to do that. I see it done in tandem because, okay, now we really need this information to be applied for a really big, significant threat. So I have been in part of processes that have actually gathered that information from tribal members, elders, in the form of interviews or surveys, workshops, or just reviewing older records, or maybe where there was past recordings, and trying to organize that for use for climate change. But what's, you know, sometimes interesting, you know, you guys are, I think, skipping ahead a little in really good ways that other use cases, but we're going to focus for a second still on your own plans, right? Your own plans where you don't have to really work with anybody else if you don't want. But oftentimes you might be working with a consultant, right? I feel like that's one of the challenge areas, is even when you have somebody on contract who might have even signed an NDA, it's still not maybe a wise idea to share some of the most sensitive information. And that's happened with me plenty of times. And so that makes it challenging in some ways to do the analysis that you really need to do, especially to protect cultural resources. And so that has just, on the right here, I'm just showing one way that I have tried to work within the boundaries and sensitivities of a particular tribe. And that is like, the onus is on me to ask questions the right way, to ask the questions that don't encourage the tribe to breach its own level of comfort. And so on the right here is just one thing I came up with, which is just a table. I said, okay, I don't want you to tell me anything about the specifics, but the areas that I know you want to protect in your adaptation plan when we get there are gathering and ceremonial places, burial grounds, other cultural sites, landmarks, landscapes or objects, culturally important plant or wildlife species, places key to traditional hunting, gathering, fish or fishing practices, and otherwise just this like bucket of sovereignty, anything that's going to threaten tribal sovereignty. And then there's other. And all I ask is that they go high, medium, low for each of the climate hazards that we've decided are coming their way. So to what extent is sea level rise going to affect any of these things? So at least we can track it somehow, record it into the vulnerability assessment, and somehow address it in the adaptation plan, rather than walking into an adaptation plan, coming up with strategies completely blind to these very big risks. So that was one workaround, and you can see here what it meant was just this table. I provide maps where the exposures are going to occur, and I'm not asking where on the map cultural resources exist, only to what extent these exposures are going to hit a certain kind of cultural resource, and to what extent you think that that's a big risk. So it's a workaround, and I'm curious how you guys have done it in your own tribes, trying to protect cultural resources and not give away sensitive information. I saw you nodding, Tim. I wonder if you've encountered something like this.
We actually have a grant right now where we're deciding that approach and process. We have a BIA climate resilience grant, and it's to assess our cultural sites out at the ocean. So there's about 25 sites involved with a multitude of landowners, so various jurisdictions, private landowners, nonprofits, state parks, and federal seashore. So it's when we go to talk about this at the assessment level and then bring in our citizens in a workshop, the debate is, do we put up a map on the wall with every exact site GPSed, or do we do like a buffer type of larger bubble or something saying in this area is cultural sensitivity, and to talk about both the site itself, its location, and then what kind of impacts we're talking about. Not only sea level rise, but the big thing we have out here is erosion and just the wind, and some of these land managers aren't doing anything about it. And these sites in essence just blowing away or just falling down into the ocean. So it's trying to be proactive and informative and engage our community, but also use that information in an adaptation strategy that then we can go back to partners and then look at more funding through other grants to support that next step. What does protection look like? Protection in place. Yeah. We're going to have to salvage archaeology to stabilize the site, or in essence move things away or something, and then that's a whole nother field. But just it's something the tribe has dealt with over the years. We're now just getting more hands-on about it and actually looking at the area to make some pretty powerful decisions here that will guide those processes of adaptation probably the next 20-30 years. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I'm imagining that a lot of that work is involving your Tribal Historic Preservation Office. Buffy McQuillan, my wonderful colleague, who is the TIPO at Grayton. And it really, really is a tough thing to do, especially when you're talking about different jurisdictions. This is not just on tribal trust land. This is within the tribal ancestral landscape. And so, even this, the table here, which is really useful, if you expand that out, or actually it says ancestral lands. It doesn't say trust lands. What are the potential impacts? But here in Paula, we're talking about the ancestral lands. We're talking about everywhere from, the city of Riverside to the city of Oceanside to Temecula and Fallbrook, Camp Pendleton, all the way out to, the east. And we start to get into some of the desert region. We overlap with, other tribes that are family and relations. And boy, howdy, does it start to get really complicated. And it's so hard because, there's a lot of people out there who want to protect things, who aren't Indigenous, but they see something and they say, oh, I've heard that this is a cultural site, or I found something out here and it's so important that we protect it. And sometimes those same people are the ones who are telling all their friends about it because they're so excited about it. And then you get the Yahoo who goes out there and decides that a piece of rock art will only be enhanced by him scratching his initials next to it, or chiseling it off and taking it to put on their mantelpiece. And how do we can't be in all places at all times and manage the different points of view of all people. And plus, on top of that, be educating non-Indigenous people and people who don't work with tribes on what exactly all of that means, and how what they think are their best intentions are actually more harmful than helpful. Head explodes.
A lot of this supposes or assumes that a tribe is able to map their cultural resources, at least internally. And I wonder how many are actually working to try to pull this into GIS and house it in-house, but store it so securely Because that's what this approach that I'm sharing here is really more about, okay, let me give you the map, and you can overlay it onto your own map. Don't show it to me, but somebody trusted, in-house, knowledgeable, probably the TIPO, would want to overlay that and take a look. I imagine lots of tribes are attempting to do some GIS.
I think a lot of tribes are doing GIS if they have that capacity in-house. And then we can also get data from existing repositories for sites and get that GIS data, for example, in California from one of the CRIS centers, the California Historical Resource Information Centers, and that are scattered throughout the state. But that's only the stuff that's been recorded by archaeologists doing surveys. And that's a whole other thing for us to talk about, is the distinction between a tangible resource like a rock art panel or an archaeological site, and something that is intangible, like a grove of trees that is important for ritual purposes, or a river where maybe naming ceremonies take place. Those cultural values attached to those places and landscapes exist in cultural memory and practice, but they're not physical. So you're not going to get that at a CRIS center, and then that's not going to be on a GIS layer that you can overlay. So it starts to become super complicated. But I think, Angie, your point about it being well protected is what's the most important. Those are discussions that take place internally with a tribe's cultural resource committee or advisory group, if they have one, with their elders, with leadership. In the case of tribes that are trying to regain and repractice some of those knowledges, talking to related tribes and practitioners, and just have that be internal. All you have to do when it comes to the landscape itself is say, this is something that's significant to us and we want to protect it. You don't have to say why publicly.
Yeah. So yeah, I've seen tribes withhold it even from the planning evaluation process, or do a piece of that internally. And I've seen tribes just say, well, we're going to write these things in our report, but we're not releasing the report. We're keeping these reports very highly confidential. So I think there's a couple different ways to go about it. And I had a really interesting conversation at the Climate Adaptation Forum with somebody who's doing this at NOAA with the Department of Defense. So, and you wouldn't think the military and tribes have that much in common. However, the military needs to keep their sites super secure too, and they cannot release that information even to their own partner agency at NOAA. So NOAA had to do the same kind of thing. Here's your exposure maps. You go figure out where your hazards and risks are. Fascinating.
Yeah, since you brought up the military, I'm just going to give a little anecdote here. You can probably tell from my tone, it's not going to be a positive one. We are currently dealing with the Navy and some of the Channel Islands that are basically owned and operated by the Navy. And it's, boy, I'll tell you, trying to get cultural monitors out there for military work that's taking place, like creating runways or bombing areas. And this is on San Nicolas Island. If you've heard of the book, The Island of the Blue Dolphins, that was the fictionalized account of the woman who was on that island for years. And it's a children's book. I read it as a kid and was like, oh, I want to be the girl, on the island with making my skirt out of cormorant feathers and all that. But the reality of it is very different. And we've had monitors on San Nicolas. We're working with the Navy. This is not a climate change thing, but it certainly could be in terms of their management of that island. But the whole island is a cultural site, the entire island. And so that makes things very, very complicated. So good on them, I guess, for trying. But again, just a caution that what the agencies are putting in their layers is just the physical stuff. It's not the intangible stuff. And that's something that is something the tribes are going to have to tackle internally and figure out. And one other not a warning exactly, but just something to keep in mind. And it's a little bit the thing that people don't like to say out loud. But the reality is that there are sometimes people within your own tribal community or who are tribal citizens who also can't be trusted with this information. And, I hate to say that, it sounds terrible, but I'm going to give you a sort of a national example. The governor of Oklahoma is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and he is terrible. He is not a friend to the tribes. So I would not be giving that guy any information about Cherokee cultural sites, because he's probably just going to say, "Oh, I don't care. Can we drill for oil there? Then that's what we're going to do." And I don't know why I'm not thinking of his name. Oh, Stitt, Kevin Stitt, governor of Oklahoma, and also Markwayne Mullen, who is a senator or a representative to Congress. I forget which one. And he's also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, also not a friend to tribes. And I see my friend Lisa put in the chat, that was a really light touch. And Lisa, I don't know if you're being sarcastic, but you also know me, and the fact that I didn't drop F-bombs probably is what you're referring to. Hi, Lisa, I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, welcome, Lisa, and Ryan too. We're happy to have you join us. We're right now we're just getting into it with talking about climate change and the context of using cultural data and TEK. We're talking about different use cases. So we just went through, one use case is the tribe using its own information for its own planning process. That one probably less challenging than some other of these use cases. So I'm going to move us into the next use case, which we've already started touching on a little bit, but this is like external planning, right? It's not the tribes, it's some other entity, maybe the state, the federal government, a local government, or some other entity developing. We're going to talk about it in the context of developing a climate adaptation plan. I see this happening all of the time. Some cases it's like a nonprofit is trying to do the right thing, doing a climate adaptation plan for a whole region or something, trying to do its best to engage tribes, right? Asking for input, really wanting to get it right, and often not. But how do we do this? So, here's how I'm describing the needs, and I want you guys to correct me. I think when in this situation, there is a planning process that affects tribal interests, their assets, their ancestral lands, that the tribes have an interest in all the vulnerabilities and strategies that are going to affect their cultural and other resources across their reservation and or ancestral lands. And it sounds like, and this is what we've heard in something that my team developed, the California Tribal Gap Analysis, we heard, tribes are generally supportive of bringing TEK to the process of assessing and tracking environmental and climate changes. Because doing so can help ensure that the planning is well informed and that cultural resources both on and off the reservation are properly protected. Lots and lots of challenges in getting it right? I mean, you want to be asked, but when it comes to actually handing something over, it sounds really challenging. So again, back to sharing externally only what could be made public. And this is due to past failures by those agencies to protect tribal information, right? There's good reason for the concern and the hesitation. And what we talked about earlier in the reading, TEK can be mistrusted, misinterpreted, or omitted. So sometimes you hand it over in good faith for a good reason, and it's not used appropriately. And that, the tribe really wants to protect specific cultural resources or sites, like cultural places, but can't be specific, like we were talking about earlier, about location or details. Hard enough when it's your own internal planning process, really hard, I think, when it's somebody else's planning process. So back to that example where a nonprofit's running a regional climate adaptation plan, asking for input, wants to know where to protect cultural resources. How can you help them protect it without really telling them too much about what and where they are? So those are the challenges and needs that I see, but I want to hear from you all what you've experienced when you are interacting with a planning process that's not your own.
Just looking for people unmuting, but not seeing anyone. As always, I have a lot to say. So I appreciate the two examples that we have on the right here. Again, from California, the fifth climate assessment has developed a tribal advisory group, and the Climate Science Alliance has a reference on how to build those partnerships with tribes. And they are a community organization that has a tribal working group based in Southern California, but have shared their resources for how to develop meaningful engagement with tribes. And that's something that I think government folks, state, federal, and local, really need when it comes to their external planning. So I've worked a lot with Patricia Kennedy, who's guiding the Tribal Advisory Group for the 5th assessment. I hope that those of you in other states have something similar going on with the agencies in your state or region, and also at the federal government level. But as you see, we have some of the same challenges. So how do we manage this when we are working with those outside agencies? And again, I think it's worthwhile in your adaptation plan to develop a strategy for how you are going to work with agencies and what your protocols are going to be for sharing the information that you have and what you expect from them in terms of protecting the information that you share. But also to perhaps, if you can, if not on your own, then maybe in collaboration with other tribes in your region to form a group to do this, to bring your concerns to those agencies and let them know what they could possibly do differently. And it's again, another example of where perhaps an agency or a group thinks that they're doing things right, but then they hear from a tribe that they didn't consider some of the tribal points of view on what their policy was actually going to cause. So that sounds very nebulous. So here's the specific example. The marine protection areas in California. Those were very well-intended areas that were set aside as being protected from any sort of resource extraction. So say you're just somebody walking along the beach, you're not supposed to take seaweed or shells or pick up a sand dollar or something like that. They're marine protected areas and they are meant to be undisturbed for conservation purposes. Well, if you're a tribal citizen and your nation is near those areas and you have traditionally harvested shellfish or picked up seaweed or gathered basket materials or medicinal plants that grow on the shore, you can't do it anymore in those marine protected areas. And some research on that, interestingly, has found that some of those resources are actually helped by having sustainable gathering practices, by making room for future generations of those plants and animals. That if you do research showing here's the comparison between an area that's left completely free of human touch and an area that has allowed sustainable traditional harvesting practices, the one with the harvesting actually is healthier. So if you have this idea that you are conserving nature by keeping people out of it, that is a way of denying the tribal traditional knowledge, which is that humans aren't separate from nature. Humans are a part of nature and a part of the habitat and the environment. And so a lot of these resources have not developed in healthy ways in the absence of humans. Rather, they've developed in healthy ways. Healthily, is that a word? It is now. In the presence of humans, but in this way that is meant to be sustainable and not just kind of the typical model of take until all the otters are extinct kind of thing, which is what we saw happening on the California coast in the late 1800s with otter harvesting for fur. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about healthy, sustainable, traditional practices for the immediate use of people. So that's an external thing. It's like we think we're doing good by keeping people out. You're actually doing harm by keeping traditional people and traditional practices out. Tim, I see you nodding, so I don't necessarily expect you to comment on that, but I'm just glad to get the validation.
Well,
Hi, this is Ryan. I just wanted to say we have that happening up here too. We have like wildlife conservation, and they are keeping people out, like Camas prairies, for instance. And I mean, it just kind of defeats the purpose, right? But we're saying the same thing, that the land needs to be tended to, but obviously in a responsible way. And so it's just really a slap in the face when they try to conserve these areas or like oak bottoms and just say you can't go in there. And then it's like you're just in the same place, right? You still don't have access. and it's because they don't know the harvesting practices. Very sad.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that, Ryan. And for others, Ryan is in Oregon, right?
Yeah, I'm in Oregon.
Yeah. Yeah, so good. Somebody from outside of California. Yeah. And Yvonne, too, in the chat says we have a couple of tribes that are implementing that as a resource. But you guys, it's a tough hurdle to overcome, to be constantly telling agency folks, whether it's state, federal, or local, that this is not the best way forward. And sometimes we have to overcome laws that are in place and have to remind that there needs to be like a carve out or a set aside of some sort for tribal use. And so that's something that, as far as the question of how can we solve this, and I think maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I think we're going to get to this a little bit in our wisdom well development today when we do our mural board. Maybe we can answer that question a little bit. What are some ways to solve some of these challenges? And just remembering that we're trying to come up with ideas and strategies for other tribal folks who are going to come back and hopefully watch these videos and benefit from our own experiences. So yeah, sorry if I'm pushing the agenda, Angie.
That's okay. You guys are kind of making me, there's another use case here. So this is where there is an actual external planning process. Another use case would be where there's a problem, but no actual policy or planning process around it. And you need to share information into some vacuum, right? That may or may not be prepared to take it. That might be a whole nother problem. But yeah, I am really interested as we go to hear how you guys have handled it. Like, how do you, in transmitting this information, how do you do it sensitively? Here's another use case. Grant reporting. You've probably dealt with this. I think that various state and federal entities are waking up to this reality that when you get a grant, you don't necessarily want to commit to giving away all of your sensitive, confidential information. So at least here in California, we're hearing a lot of conversations around, all right, well, let's dial back. Let's be more sensitive about these reporting requirements and allow tribes to stay confidential about certain things. And then we probably don't need a lot of time on this, but I guess I'm interested. How many of you are experiencing this where you have a grant, you need money, you're often relying on external dollars to do all this climate change work. But in exchange, you've had to give up something that you really aren't authorized to give up, or it's just a bad idea.
So this is another instance where I'm going to call on somebody and to see it from the other side. And that is my friend Osamu, who I have worked with extensively at the California Department of Public Health. And Osamu, I think you might have a few insights or ideas to share on how you have worked with tribes and helped to preserve sensitive data or to protect sensitive data.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I have used a number of different tools before, ranging from MOUs, where the relationship between either the university I was at or the state agency is really defined in terms of
you're
breaking up.
Yeah, you went into a wormhole. We can't hear any of that. Well, he's muted now. Okay. Maybe you can type some stuff into the chat.
Yeah, or call in or something.
I think he actually is on his phone.
Oh, well, it sounded like it was going to be really good info. I would like to hear it.
So I'm looking at some of the stuff in the chat, and actually, I think this relates to the previous slide, but I see that Tim asked if there's a tribal network where we can share concepts or approaches regarding sea garden type projects. I would love that. But actually, as far as the grant reporting is concerned, yeah, this has also been a tough one where those deliverables might be information that the tribes don't want to be in a public forum. And you learn quickly when you're doing this kind of work that if it's a deliverable for a publicly funded project, then that means it's publicly available, even if it's not put on a website or something. If somebody does a Public Records Act request for California or a FOIA request for the feds, Freedom of Information Act, then that's stuff that can get out there. And yeah, that's a hard one, because those who give the money want to see that the money's being spent in the way that it was intended. But sometimes you're spending it on something that is not for general public knowledge. So before Osamu went into the wormhole, he said something about an MOU. So if you can work all that stuff out in a memorandum of understanding, or just get somebody to work with you on any Public Records Act or FOIA types of outputs, that people could potentially have access to. I know for me, another example, I'm on EPA's Tribal Science Council, and we had a long discussion, and that's an EPA funded work group. We had a long discussion about what was going to be included in the minutes of those meetings, because the minutes as an EPA work product are FOIable. So people could see those potentially. And so we decided amongst ourselves that we'd have a policy. If there was something that we didn't want to be FOIable, we just wouldn't discuss it in our general meetings. We would have those discussions in our tribal caucus, which were just the tribal folks, no EPA folks, and therefore were not subject to FOIA because they couldn't be included in the minutes. Those were just the tribal representatives in those meetings. Now that's a very specific example, but that could be the kind of thing that you work out, where you decide with the granting agency ahead of time, this is what needs to be kept protected, and then put that back on the agency to say, what are you going to do to help us keep this information out of the general public? And there are ways it can be done. You just ask your grant agency or project officer, if they don't know, to talk to their agency's legal counsel. And they can find ways, just sometimes you have to push them a little bit.
Well, yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the Public Records Act. That came up in the California Tribal Gap Analysis. So we're hearing from tribes all over the place that this has been a real barrier for them, actually, being able to access resources in some cases, or sort of feeling scared to even go for a grant if it means that they're going to have to go beyond their comfort level in giving information. All right, so the last use case I wanted to talk about, and actually, did anybody else have anything they wanted to share? Okay, grant reporting.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Hey, oh, great. Yeah, just to go back to grant reporting for 1 second, I think that one, in addition to like the MOUs or data sharing agreements that you might be able to work out ahead of time, it's helpful to look at the product that is being, asked for in the grant, and to kind of anticipate ahead of time if the tribe might need an opportunity to redact some portions of the product, that you kind of write that in explicitly into the terms that, part of the process is going to be, okay, the tribe will go over the, the final plan or report or whatever it is, and have the authority to kind of decide which sections they're willing to submit, kind of to mark that deliverable off. So I think that's one, strategy that you could deploy if you wanted to collaborate with a state or federal agency, or but you were worried that, what they might demand as kind of a product from that process.
See a lot of opportunity here for somebody to develop some templates here that tribes can use, some boilerplate language to try to insert into a grant award agreement, or for the state side or federal side, if there's a best practice, like a state agent, and then probably in California, somebody is writing this the right way right now, to share that with other agencies as a best practice. Thanks, Osamu. All right, last one I wanted to mention here, use case number 4, post-planning, TEK, and cultural data. This one's a little harder to get my head around, but just knowing that at some point you're going to adopt a climate adaptation plan, you're still going to need to have kind of ready access to using TEK or cultural data in a lot of ways. So that might look like, in the process of implementing or monitoring your adaptation plan, you might need to respond to a climate event. You might need to implement a strategy where you really need to do something where you have to understand you have to use your ecological knowledge. So a little bit more on the needs might help me explain this better, but tribes may need to gather and use relevant TEK and cultural data regularly or intermittently, such as when a flood, fire, or heat wave occurs. So examples, a flood might be coming, you might need to know where your culturally important species, food sources, or documents are. Like in real time, right? Like right now, a flood is coming. Local governments do this all the time. All of our archives are stored in the basement of this courthouse, which is flooding right now. So like usually at least they know it. So they have that information on hand, they can act quickly. So I'm wondering to what extent, maybe tribes do have that information where the cultural stuff is, so that they have to act fast to protect it. They could. Another example might be prescribe or respond to fire. So we were talking about this already, using TEK about local fire patterns and strategies, right? So that's going to happen. You might be doing fire mitigation up front, or a fire might come and you might need that information readily available. And it may be that you're working with outside agencies, right? So you got the local fire department, maybe federal wildlife, state wildlife, or fire folks. And you might need to share that information kind of quickly so that they have your TEK, your knowledge about fire. And then using TEK for effective ecological restoration after a disaster. Those are 3 of probably 10,000 examples of how you might need to have this information on hand for real-time use. Does that resonate with folks? Osamu, are you raising your hand again?
Yeah, another area that I'm just thinking about with this post-planning period, or even call it like the kind of, I'm seeing here maybe like the emergency response period, if some other incident actually happens that you have tried to plan for. Recently, I heard about an example of a tribe that was during a wildfire that was on both tribal land and nearby. They hadn't worked out with the fire department, the county fire team ahead of time, what the protocol was for them providing mutual aid on the tribal lands. And so there was I think a sequoia grove or some other kind of very culturally significant tree grove that they were hoping to protect, that the tribe ended up having to really scramble to figure out how to defend themselves from having a canopy fire. And so, I kind of wonder how much of that could have been worked out ahead of time with fire response, in terms of like, what are the culturally, if it's something like tree groves that maybe it's not as sensitive to protect their location, can you figure out with other folks who might be involved in emergency response how to highlight where those areas are, so that you can make sure to get protection there if an incident happens.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a process for that, like declaring priority areas without having to tell them why.
Hi, this is Ryan again. So a project that we've done, we're still coding our TEK interviews. So first of all, we have them digitized, so they're in the cloud, so to say. And I have paper copies as well. So we went through, had to reread each one, right? We put it in this thing that it does it from audio, like it types it up for you. But then we have to we have to hire people to listen to every single interview, because a lot of these tribal folks, like they're so soft spoken, I have to go through and listen to each one, rewrite it so it's perfectly. But so then I So anyways, that kind of lives in the cloud too. So that's like one way of like keeping it where it would be safe. And then what we're doing is like using, after we've coded these interviews though, it's more about mitigation, not like you don't want to wait until you already have an emergency, right?
Right.
So what we're doing is, okay, we have a lot of people talked about fire, how they used to do these cultural burns or whatever. And we actually just had a webinar on traditional burning, and it was kind of great because we got some tribes excited who are wanting to like do it. But so it's more about using the TEK to say like, okay, what is different now from then? And so like, what practices do we need to start revitalizing now to work on these kind of things? Instead of, and it kind of goes hand in hand with emergency planning. But
Mhm.
I mean, I think if you're thinking about waiting till the last minute to like interject, I think you're sort of thinking on the wrong path. I think we've got to think about TEK as like, okay, how do we integrate it into right now to prevent these disasters? And that's where we're at in our process. And we've done, I think now we've interviewed 5 tribes and hoping to do another one this year. So I've already done like 50 interviews with elders, probably going to do about another 10.
It's all so much work. I can hear how much time is being spent into doing that. It's so important.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I'm actually like in the process of hiring an intern to help me code the interviews because it just takes so long. But right, good things don't happen overnight. So I think when it comes to this TEK though, we really have to think like methodically how to make it like last through the generations, right? I mean, this information has lasted through the generations, and so just really thinking about like how to make it useful and especially when it comes to planning for emergency mitigation with climate change.
I imagine you have to think about security of your data platforms too, like storing that in a way that's not hackable.
Yeah, I work in we have a tribal epicenter, so it's already safe and stored. So I'm guessing, but then also after I do the interviews, like I hand over them to, like I've handed them over to the like the tribal museums and stuff, and they actually digitize them as well and archive them for future generations. Just so there's like several different sources just in case something happens to one, right? There's always a backup somewhere too. But I would say through your tribal epi data centers, obviously the tribes are going to have to sign agreements that's where they could be stored, but that's one really great way because it is so safe.
Wow, you could teach a whole training on digitizing DEK, which would probably be really interesting. Osama, is that a new hand?
I think that's
Maybe
an old hand.
Oops, sorry, no,
Okay.
that's an old hand.
That's okay. I do that all the time.
I was gonna lower it. I was gonna slap his hand down. No, we have a great example. Tyra put in the chat talking about the recent fires in Lahaina on Maui and the records that were lost in the fires there. I'll tell you guys honest, I had a dream. I literally had a dream that the reservation here in Paula was on fire. And I went to our cultural center. Yes, thank you for the face palm, Tim. And I know you have to leave us in a few minutes. So that's what a great thing for you to leave with. My anxiety dream, where I was in the center and I was like, I can only take one thing. I can only take one thing. Now, in that dream, I wasn't talking about things that can be digitized, like, files and papers. It was actually the baskets. And I was thinking, I can only grab one basket. Which one do I take? And you know what? When I sleep, I want to be not thinking about work and the things that make me anxious, but my anxieties come into my dream world. I dreamed last night that one of our transfer station trucks drove off a cliff. So, there you go. But I loved all these use cases. It really starts to make you think about what you need to manage and take care of. And even in terms of things like, bye, Tim, even in terms of things like, you think that you've got things saved in a way that's going to be good for perpetuity. And then you find out that computers aren't made with CD drives anymore. So everything you have saved on a CD now needs to be transferred to the cloud, and what happens if your cloud storage facility, catches fire? I mean, there's a point at which, you know, you're going to back up to your backup to your backup. But honestly, too, here's another sort of sticky thing about that. Cloud storage and all those servers take a ton of energy and are actually contributing to greenhouse gas emissions in the climate crisis because of the energy it's required to keep those computers running to save all that stuff that's in the cloud. It's not literal clouds, it's giant machines. And so, you know, just another thing to be thinking about in terms of our adaptation and mitigation strategies. So, all right, we're on the Q&A and participation slide, but I feel like we've been getting some great participation.
I just want to maybe make this one an opportunity to talk about anything we might not have covered yet. Anything else that you think is related here? Tribes, climate change, TEK, cultural data. Did we miss a use case or a challenge? Or anything else you might want to share about your experiences? I think we had a really good conversation, and we'll have a different kind of discussion next. Well, yeah. Thank you for sharing what you did.
Yeah, I think we've gotten a lot just in the conversation. So
well, great. So as always, we kind of finish up with a discussion in our mural board. So I'll bring this up, but these are our prompts, which we can kind of input in some of what we've already discussed into some of these questions. But the first one is, and all of us will have, actually, Tina, would you mind throwing it in the chat so everybody could open up the mural for themselves? The first question is going to be, how do you use TEK to protect your community and its cultural resources from climate change? What challenges and successes do you have managing TEK and cultural data in-house? What would you like to see your TEK, how would you like to see your TEK used by outside governments to help inform climate decisions? And finally, what challenges and successes do you have sharing TEK and cultural data externally? So the other one was internally.
all right, so if you go to the mural, we should have this set up so that folks can just type in. Let's try that and see what happens.
I'll be visiting Rabbit.
Yeah, and just if you're not familiar with Mural, just double click on the screen and it should create a little sticky note for you. And then you can write things in there into your sticky note that answers the questions.
Oh, am I opening the wrong one? I am. Hang on. So let us know if anybody's struggling to actually type in their own post-it note. I guess I'm visiting
fish.
All right.
Visiting hippopotamus.
All right, so we'll all stay on group 1, by the way. We're not going to break up for a small group. Why don't we start here? And maybe this just is, so, you know, to remind folks or tell folks that are new, when we do these murals, we like to compile what we've talked about in a way so that we can develop a wisdom well out of it. That's basically, we turn this into a 1-pager that can be easily shared with other tribes, where we're storing some wisdom, giving people some food for thought who are dealing with the same stuff. So the idea here is to help us compile some of the things we've maybe already discussed or haven't discussed yet.
Sorry, that was me. Didn't mean to do that. How do I undo that?
Undo, abort.
I actually don't know how I undo it, so I'm just gonna have to.
Up at the top, there's an undo button.
Oh, is there?
Top left.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so I can undo and then undo my undo. There we go. Oh my God, so sorry. Yeah, okay. It's funny trying to help other people figure this out, and then I can't even do it myself. That's funny. Okay. So, yeah, we can just work on our own and then talk amongst ourselves. So we've got a visiting spider, a visiting fish, visiting seahorse. And If you're not able to type into a box, let us know, and I'll see about changing the settings, but you should be able to do it. So let's see. Challenges and successes in managing TEK and cultural data in-house. So I'm going to add some of that. Ah.
I think we've talked about this. I'm sort of writing in what we've already discussed under this first one, how to use TEK to protect your community's cultural resources from climate change. We talked about informing tribal vulnerability assessments to understand exposures and impacts and utilize historically effective tribal practices for adaptation. I think I will also make another one to reflect the other topic we discussed, which was to inform external vulnerability assessments. Kind of full. Feel free to think or talk out loud or skip ahead. So it's like we're kind of adding in what we know here. Maybe Ryan, you could on this third one. Oh, sorry, not the third one. The second one here, it'd be good to talk a little bit about your digital process.
So I'm just putting in here under some of the challenges for sharing TEK and cultural information externally. And a lot of people don't understand why the information is sensitive. Oh, what is this little dot here that I'm moving around? I don't know what that is.
Sure.
Hey, what am I showing up as? Because I now see my name being moved around. I think that must be Tina.
The dot was me. I tried to write in there in it because I didn't. It's kind of hard. I'm on my phone, so I couldn't put a sticky in there. But what I wrote in there was that people outside of tribes don't see TEK as an actual science when we know it's indigenous science. So it's not, you know what I mean? It's not taken seriously outside of our communities for the most part.
Okay, well, I just put that into a note for you, so that way it's in there. Yeah, if there's any others that you want to say, if you don't want to try to type it into your phone, I'm happy to, or one of us can take dictation for you.
I do, because it's like I was trying on one and it was really hard. I don't know if, let's see, being used for outside government to inform decisions. So I would like to see TEK being used, like actually used with fish and wildlife and natural resources, right? Like it should be an integrated system where you're using Western science and indigenous science. So one thing that we've also found is that, just say working with Nez Perce tribe, they said again and again that fish and wildlife is like every time we tell them what they're doing is wrong, and they said, and they do it anyways, and it's a mistake, we have to go in and then fix every time because they didn't take us seriously or believe us. And being stewards of our own land, just it's like they have a seat at the table, they can talk, right? But they don't actually let them integrate their actual knowledge, right? So it's like, we'll listen to you, but we're really not gonna let you have any say though. So that's a problem, right? We need more than just a seat. We need to have a space that we can make decisions. However, say that. Sorry, it's very long-winded.
No, I hear you. I put on here, if asking for tribal knowledge, then actually use it. Listen to tribes and take them seriously.
Implementing it.
Yeah.
And then one last thing that I just thought of when you guys were talking about yep, sure, it takes energy, it takes space, it takes all this things that, you know, might not be here in the future. And so I was at ATNI yesterday and listening to some old man. I was like, yeah, he's so right. But also doing all those interviews, you know, the last question I asked these old folks was like, what do you want for the younger generation? So really it's passing down the knowledge. It's not letting that die out. And a way that we can do that, right, so it survives orally, is a lot of folks talked about start to, like, we need to integrate these into tribal schools when they're little, not just a summer camp, not for a week, right? We need to, they all said, get the kids off the technology, off social media, like actually get them back outside to reconnect with the land. That way they have this knowledge and it will be passed on in that way, like it always has. And so they wanted to see more youth getting educated to take over these jobs too, right? To be like fish and wildlife, to be lawyers, to just to work more with the land. So I think bringing the youth into that.
I think that's great. I heard some of that at the summit that I attended yesterday as well. So I have that under other needs, you know, connect kids with the land so knowledge is passed in the traditional way, integrate knowledge into everyday education, schools, etc., passing down the knowledge to younger generations. So yeah, these are things that we need to do. And I can see that, again, being part of the adaptation plan. What is the education component so that we are teaching the next generation how to do these things, how to basically, you know, live in a more harmonious way that's not going to make climate issues worse and hopefully makes things better.
Well, I think with this too, that also just goes back to the one discussion that when we talked about also working with the land. So I heard a lot of older folks too talk about teaching the practices of even like hunting and gathering, that plays into the part of climate change. I'm gonna quit talking now. I've said too much.
No, you're great. I'm loving this. I'm loving this. So working with the land, that's a success, I would say, when people are working with the land. You know, so like reintroducing or continuing traditional practices and management practices. Yeah, that's the thing I really noticed about being up there in Washington State was the clams and the clam gardens. And, you know, before he left, Tim from Grayton had put in the chat, you know, is there anything we can do to restore some of these sea gardens? And, you know, I think that is both a success and a challenge, because we can show successfully that these native practices are actually better ways of managing the landscape. That's a success, but the challenge is really getting agencies and land use decision makers to see that this is a success and to continue doing things in that way. The example I'm thinking of is so much of the coastal wetlands and those environments have been developed and paved over or destroyed. And because of that, we now have an increase in coastal flooding. So that was the challenge, is that a lot of those natural barriers have been destroyed, and it's a challenge getting them restored, even though we know that they're going to work. So that's on a broader scale too. That's not just for the work here in Paula. I'm just thinking in general. In more places where sea level rise or storm surge is getting worse, restoring those natural wetlands will really mitigate those impacts. And that's a kind of a traditional knowledge. Let's see, I'm looking on some of the other answers. How do you use TEK to protect your community? I know we lost some of our tribal participants who had to leave for other meetings, like Lisa and Tim. So I'm just looking to see if there's any other folks. But I think, you know, this is looking good. We've got some good information here. And one thing we do when we send this out in our follow-up email is let people know that this is still up and people can add things to it if they think of things. That's the whole point of the wisdom well. Just keep dropping in your pennies and, you know, making your wishes for how you want to see TEK used in climate change adaptation.
All right. Such a good conversation. I'm so glad everybody suggested this as a topic for us to cover before, the end of this webinar series. So I actually think we can wrap up maybe slightly early, unless there's anything else that folks want to share or ask.
I just want to wish everybody, whether you're in California or not, that you have a thoughtful and meaningful California Native American Day tomorrow. We will be closed. And Heidi, I'm going to share your flyer about the event that you're having tomorrow. We will put it on our social media, right, Tina? So that people know that this is happening, the Kumeyaay New Year. Our tribal leadership is going to be in Sacramento for the annual commemoration and celebration of California's Native American history. And for those who are not in California, I will be thinking of you similarly on Indigenous Peoples Day, no longer named for that guy who claimed he discovered a place that millions of people already knew about because they were like living here already. Because we won't see you again until the third week of October. But Tina will follow up with our all of our materials, the recording, and you can always come back to the mural and add more things if you like. Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate you. And yeah, take a look at the link from AP News for the suggested reading. There's actually a video too, and that's from the climate camp that I attended in August. And so I'm in that video when that alone is enough reason to watch it. All right, thanks everybody.
I'm sorry. It's going to be relevant for our last topic. So that last webinar, don't miss it. Come back and join us. We're going to talk about reporting and sharing successes with decision makers, stakeholders, and other tribes. You've done all this climate adaptation work. How are you going to talk about it and share it? Okay, so back to you, Shasta. Sorry, just wanted to make sure folks knew.
That's great. I was just wrapping up. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you here next month.